He had power, wealth, and everything money could buy except peace. Behind the glass walls of his New York skyscraper office, billionaire Nathaniel Cole ran a global tech empire. But at home, in his $20 million brownstone, lived a little boy named Oliver who hadn't spoken since the death of his mother. And when Nathaniel hired a nanny just to keep the silence manageable, he never expected one hug from that quiet woman would shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. And about himself, the Cole residence was a masterpiece of architecture, vaulted ceilings, imported Italian marble, and paintings older than the country itself. But to Nathaniel, it had become a mausoleum of memories. His son, Oliver, barely 6 years old, hadn't spoken in nearly 10 months. Since the car crash that took his mother, he'd retreated into himself, communicating only in drawings and glances. Nathaniel had tried everything: speech therapists, child psychologists, even music therapy. Nothing worked. He'd resigned himself to guilt and silence. Every night, he sat in his home office, drowning in contracts and silence, avoiding the quiet footsteps of the boy down the hall. Then one Tuesday morning, his assistant knocked on his door with a thin file and hesitant eyes. "Sir, there's someone here to interview for the nanny position. Her name is Grace Langley. You didn't mention we were hiring again." Nathaniel didn't remember approving it. The last nanny had quit after 3 days, citing emotional burnout. Still, he nodded. "Send her in." Grace walked in quietly, like a shadow wrapped in sunlight. She wore a simple blue blouse, dark jeans, and her curly hair tied up. Number. Resume. No portfolio. Just a small leather bag and calm eyes. "I understand your son hasn't spoken in some time," she said gently. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "And what makes you think you're qualified to help him?" "I don't," she said. "But I've spent a lot of time with children who've lost their voice. Sometimes they don't need help talking. They need help feeling safe." There was something in her tone. Not arrogance, not desperation, just truth. Nathaniel, for reasons he couldn't explain, said, "You can start tomorrow." Part 2. The hug that changed everything. The first 2 days passed quietly. Grace spoke to Oliver, read him stories, cooked simple meals, and never pushed. On the 3rd day, Nathaniel came home early from a meeting. As he walked past the playroom, he paused. Inside, Grace was kneeling beside Oliver. He was holding a crayon and a picture he'd drawn, 2 stick figures holding hands. Grace said softly, "Is that your dad?" Oliver nodded once. "And who's this?" she asked. He pointed to the other figure. Then, suddenly, he dropped the crayon and wrapped his arms around Grace's waist. Nathaniel's breath caught. She froze for a moment, then slowly hugged him back, and in that moment, quiet, fleeting, unremarkable to the world, Nathaniel felt something shift in his chest. Later that night, Oliver left the drawing on his father's desk. Written in shaky letters were 2 words: "Me and her." That was the first time Oliver had identified another person since the funeral. Nathaniel knew something was different about Grace. She didn't ask for favors or special treatment. She barely spoke to the staff. But somehow, in a matter of days, she had cracked something no therapist could. He wanted to ask her how, but something told him she wouldn't answer directly. Nathaniel stood frozen near the doorway, the familiar melody wrapping around him like a ghost from a life he thought was buried. The lullaby Grace hummed wasn't just any song, it was one his late wife had composed herself during the early months of Oliver's life. She had only ever sung it to their son at bedtime, a soft tune that only their family would know. To hear it again, from the lips of a woman who was supposed to be a stranger, cracked open something in Nathaniel's chest he had kept sealed for far too long. "How do you know that song?" His voice was quiet but firm, cutting through the cool garden air. Grace looked up from the grass, her hand still gently brushing Oliver's curls. She didn't seem startled, only calm, like she had been expecting this moment. "Oliver hums it sometimes when he sleeps," she answered carefully. The melody stuck with me. I didn't realize it would upset you, but Nathaniel didn't believe that. The song was too specific, too personal, to be something she could have simply picked up. And yet he didn't press her, he couldn't. There was a part of him, a small whisper in his gut, that wanted to see where this went, rather than confront it head on. That night, Nathaniel lay in bed longer than usual. The melody echoed in his mind, not as a tune of peace, but as a riddle. He sat up in the dark and searched Grace Langley's name online. To his surprise, nothing significant came up. No criminal records, no social media presence, no recent job history. It was as if she had existed only from the moment she entered his home. The next day, he made a few phone calls. Old contacts, former colleagues, and a few ex-military tech contractors who owed him favors. What he was looking for, he couldn't even articulate. But if Grace was hiding something, he wanted to know, needed to know, not because he distrusted her, but because she had become someone Oliver depended on, someone who had broken through to him. The irony was that Nathaniel, a man who had built his empire on knowing the digital DNA of billions of people, couldn't even trace a single thread of the woman who had brought his son back to life, and that unsettled him more than anything else. Asterisk. The following week brought a storm, literally and figuratively. Rain lashed against the windows of the Cole residence as Nathaniel arrived home late from a board meeting. The moment he stepped through the grand double doors, he sensed something was wrong. The air felt heavier, quieter. He called out for Grace. Then for Oliver, no answer. Panic rose quickly in his chest as he moved through the house, room by room. Oliver was finally found asleep in his bed, clutching the drawing Grace had helped him make the week before. But Grace, she was gone. Nathaniel stormed to the security office, pulling up the surveillance footage. At 5:12 that morning, Grace had left the house with a single bag and stepped into a black SUV. She hadn't looked back once. No one had escorted her. No words were exchanged. Just a clean, quiet departure, like she had never planned to stay long. Confused and furious, Nathaniel returned to her room. It was immaculate, stripped of any sign she'd been there. But on the bed was a single envelope, no name, no address. Just a folded photograph inside. It was old, creased, and sun-faded. A teenage girl stood in front of a children's hospital, grinning wide. Nathaniel's stomach dropped. In the corner of the photo stood a younger version of himself, 20 years old, hair messier, eyes brighter. He remembered that day. It was part of a youth volunteer program he had participated in during college. The photo had been taken during a Christmas toy drive, but it was the girl in the wheelchair at the center of the photo who stole his breath. She looked exactly like Grace, and suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. Nathaniel's heart raced. He remembered the girl now. Her name had been Mia. She was terminally ill, but always joyful, always humming melodies in the hospital ward. His wife had composed a lullaby inspired by her voice after visiting the hospital once with him. But that had been decades ago. Could Grace be her sister? Or was it possible Grace was that girl? But how? He picked up the phone and called every contact he had. His assistant, his former college professor. Even the old hospital records. Most had nothing. Others gave confusing, incomplete answers. One name, however, kept surfacing: Dr. Yasmin Alder, a former pediatric counselor who now ran a trauma-focused youth program in rural Connecticut. Without waiting another day, Nathaniel got in his car and drove through the storm. He needed answers. He needed Grace. The winding road to rural Connecticut was soaked with rain and fog, but Nathaniel pressed on. Every mile was filled with questions. Who was Grace really? Why did she leave so suddenly? And what had she meant when she said, "Sometimes silence is a child's way of surviving"? Her words echoed in his mind like a secret code he couldn't crack. He finally arrived at a modest brick building tucked behind trees near the edge of a small town. A wooden sign read, "The Alder Center for Healing and Hope." Children's voices echoed faintly inside, and from the large bay window he could see shapes moving, laughter, life, the kind of life that had been missing from his own home. Inside, the center smelled of crayons, coffee, and old books. A receptionist recognized his name and ushered him in quietly. A few minutes later, a woman in her 60s stepped into the room with a cane and a knowing gaze. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Yasmin Alder. I've been expecting you." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "You have?" Dr. Alder smiled warmly. "Grace told me you might come looking. She's here. She volunteers with us. Not full-time, but often. She's in the garden with the kids. Would you like to see her?" Nathaniel nodded, unable to find the words. They walked down a narrow hallway and out into a small courtyard where a dozen children were playing. And there, beneath an old oak tree, was Grace. She knelt beside a girl who looked to be about 8, helping her pot a small plant. The moment she saw Nathaniel, her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't run. Instead, she stood slowly, brushing soil from her hands, and met his gaze with something that looked like both apology and acceptance. "You found me," she said. He stepped closer. "You left without a word." "I wasn't supposed to stay," she whispered. "I came to help Oliver, and maybe to help myself." Nathaniel studied her face. "That photo, at the hospital, was that you?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "I was supposed to die before my 10th birthday. But I didn't. I survived barely. I spent most of my life feeling invisible. Until one day, I heard your wife's lullaby in a therapy group. I recognized it. That song saved me once. And I thought maybe it could save your son." Nathaniel's voice caught. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Grace looked away, tears brimming. "Because people like you don't usually listen to people like me unless we're wearing a uniform, holding a resume, or performing miracles. I wasn't trying to be anything more than someone who understands what it's like to be broken and to choose to live anyway." The courtyard fell quiet. Nathaniel stepped closer. "You didn't just help Oliver. You brought my son back to life. And maybe you reminded me what being alive feels like." They stood there in silence, 2 lives from completely different worlds, suddenly not so different at all. And for the first time in months, Nathaniel smiled, not the tight, professional grin he wore in boardrooms, a real one that meant something. The rain had cleared by the time Nathaniel and Grace left the Alder Center. They didn't speak much on the drive back to the city. It wasn't silence filled with tension or fear, but the kind of silence that exists between 2 people who understand one another without needing to fill the air. Grace looked out the window quietly, her fingers tracing invisible shapes against the glass, and Nathaniel focused on the road, though his thoughts raced with emotion. When they pulled up to the brownstone, Oliver was already waiting at the door. The moment he saw Grace step out of the car, his face lit up like morning sunshine. He didn't hesitate. He ran, arms open, straight into her chest. Grace knelt down and held him tightly. "I missed you," he whispered. "I missed you too," she said, her voice trembling. Nathaniel watched the scene with a heart fuller than it had been in years. His son, once locked in silence, was now speaking, expressing, feeling. And it was all because of her. Later that evening, after Oliver had gone to bed, Nathaniel and Grace sat in the kitchen, sipping tea like old friends. The walls that had stood between them for so long had finally crumbled. There were no more questions of identity or past, just the present, and the undeniable connection they now shared. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel said, his tone gentler than she'd ever heard. "Oliver doesn't just need a nanny anymore. He needs someone who understands him. Someone who sees him for who he is, not what he's supposed to be." Grace raised her eyes slowly. "And what are you saying, Nathaniel?" "I'm saying stay," he replied. "Not as an employee, Not as a guest, but as family, if you want to. She stared at him, her breath caught between surprise and disbelief. I don't know how to be that, he smiled softly. Neither. Do one, but maybe we can learn together. For the first time, Grace's eyes welled with tears she didn't try to hide. Okay, she whispered. Nathaniel reached across the table and took her hand, not as a billionaire to an employee, but as a father, as a man, and maybe as someone beginning to believe in second chances. And in that kitchen, under soft light and quiet hope, something new began, something whole, something real. **** Months passed, and the Cole residence was no longer a house defined by silence. It echoed, now with laughter, piano notes, and the sounds of a boy discovering the world again. Oliver began school with confidence, started drawing more elaborate pictures, and even invited friends over something Nathaniel once thought impossible. Each morning, he greeted Grace with a hug and a new story. And each night, she tucked him in with the same lullaby that once connected their souls, long before they had ever met. As for Nathaniel, he changed too. Board meetings still filled his calendar, but he no longer rushed out the door in the morning or buried himself in emails past midnight. He started cooking with Oliver on weekends. He took long walks with Grace where they talked about everything: music, memories, fears. There was no declaration, no dramatic confession of love. Just a gentle unfolding of something deeper: respect, care, and the kind of intimacy that comes not from romance, but from surviving something broken and rebuilding it together. One evening, they stood on the rooftop garden of the brownstone, watching the city lights flicker like stars below. Grace leaned against the railing, a soft breeze catching her curls. Nathaniel stepped beside her, quiet for a long moment. Do you ever regret coming to us? He asked. Grace turned to him, a small smile on her lips. Not for a second. You didn't just give me a job, you gave me a place to heal. And in doing that, I helped you and Oliver do the same. That's not something anyone regrets. He nodded. Slowly. I used to think healing came from fixing things, making them right. But now I realize sometimes it's just about being there. Being present, being seen. They stood in silence, watching as the wind danced through the ivy, and the hum of the city grew quieter under the stars. Downstairs, Oliver's laughter rang out from the living room. It was a different home now. Not because of wealth or renovation, but because of the people inside it. 3 people who were once strangers, lost in their own pain, now stitched together by moments of courage, trust, and quiet transformation. And though none of them could change the past, they had found something far more powerful: a future together.